Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. As you can see from the title, George Wagner, the fourth trial has begun. As promised, I am going to cover it with you. Now, before I get started in the video, I do want to give my sincerest condolences to the victim families and friends. And I also want to state that all the information found in this video is found on the internet and or social media. Yeah. All right, y'all, so we just gonna jump right into it. The trial started on September 12th of 2022. Now, I know as of my last video, I said it was gonna start a week after, like the end of August, but one of the prosecutors got sick, so they pushed it back an extra week. So before opening statements, the jury was able to go on a jury view where they saw all four crime scenes. They also were shown the Wagner house. They were shown a pond where some evidence was found at, and they were just told to kind of keep these areas in mind so while they are listening to the trial, they would kind of understand which location they were speaking about. The jury consists of 9 women and 3 men, and there is also 6 alternates, which are 5 women and 1 man. So the state is being represented by Prosecutor Rob Junk and Special Prosecutors Angela Canepa and Andrew Wilson. George Wagner IV is being represented by John Parker and Richard Nash. The presiding judge is Randy D. Deering. So again, the trial opened on September 12th of 2022, and Judge Deering gave the jury the special instructions, which were all typically normal. No outside influences, no talking about the case to other jurors, no talking about the case at all, no social media. You could write notes during the trial. Angela Canepa gave the opening statement on behalf of the state. Now, y'all, she started off really good, and I did learn a lot of information. But I do just want to point out that this opening statement was 3 hours and 48 minutes. I'm going to try my hardest to summarize as much as I can, and any of the information from my last video that I didn't elaborate on or that I got a little more information about, I will elaborate on in this video. So she starts the opening by saying that they're all here because 8 members of the Rhoden family were killed on April 21st and April 22nd of 2016. My last video, for whatever reason, I said April 26th. I'm not exactly sure why. But I do stand corrected that it was April 21st and the 22nd. Also, I said that the murders was planned for 4 months. In reality, they were being planned for 3 months. The message that Hannah Mae sent on Facebook stating that they would have to kill me first was December 9th of 2015, which would have been 4 months. She starts by saying how some of the killings were intentional and then how some of them happened just because the victim was at the Rhoden household at that time. She uses examples of how little Chris, who she refers to as Christopher Jr., how he usually had friends at the house, and the only reason that that particular night he didn't have any friends over is because he got in trouble and he was grounded. And how Hannah, her new boyfriend, Corey, was supposed to be at the house, but he left because his sister had an emergency. And how the Wagner family had no problem with killing innocent people. She then shows pictures of the victims and she breaks down their relationship amongst each other. If you saw my last video, then I did break down the relationship, but really quick. So Christopher Rhoden Sr. and Dana Rhoden had 3 kids and they were married for 13 years. Even though they were divorced, all of the family still stayed on the property. Their kids were Clarence Frankie Rhoden, Hannah Mae Rhoden, and Christopher Rhoden Jr. Then the other 3 victims is Christopher Sr., brother Kenneth Rhoden, their cousin Gary Rhoden, and the last victim is Hannah Hazel Gilly, who's Frankie's fiance. She then goes on to talk about who the intended targets are. And I'm just going to paraphrase, but basically the only person that the Wagner family had a problem with was Hannah Mae Rhoden. And they only had a problem with her because the Wagner family wanted the daughter that Hannah Mae and Jake shared. Her name is Sophia. However, the Wagner family knew that they couldn't do anything to Hannah Mae without her father, Christopher Sr., either having them arrested or retaliating. Then, once they thought about it further, they realized that Hannah's mother, Dana, would know, her brother, Frankie, would know, and her other brother, Christopher Jr., would know. Then, they also realized how close Chris and his brother, Kenneth, are. So if something were to happen to Chris, then Kenneth would either retaliate or have them arrested. So basically, the only 2 people that weren't intended targets at that point was Hannah Hazel Gilly and Gary Rhoden. She then goes back to the very beginning of Jake and Hannah's relationship. So in my last video, I told you some places I saw that she was 13 when they started dating, and then some places I saw that she was 15. So for me, she did clarify that Hannah was 13 and at the time Jake was 18. So remember in the last video, I was saying how the family didn't give any pushback as far as Jake and Hannah dating. And that was because Chris Roden Sr. and George Wagner III, which is the father, also known as Billy, they were friends. They were said to be best friends. So when they started dating, it really wasn't a big issue for the family. She talks about how Jake wanted to marry Hannah Mae, except Christopher Sr. didn't give his blessing because he didn't want Hannah to be married before she was 18. But once she got pregnant with their child, that's when all of the problems started. Jake became controlling even before Sophia was born, saying that Sophia would live with him no matter what. But what really ended the relationship for Hannah was how the Wagner family wanted Sophia to be raised. So it's reported that Angela, Jake's mom, wanted Sophia to call her mom instead of grandma, even though Hannah would be standing like right there. And that for Hannah was just the end of it all. She then goes on to talk about how after Hannah broke up with Jake, how she had a relationship with Charles Gilly, which is the other victim, Hannah Hazel's brother, which I told y'all in the last video. She speaks on how that relationship didn't work out because Charles Gilly allegedly has an addiction problem. She goes on to talk about how Hannah Mae is in a new relationship with a guy named Corey, and that how Corey had his own addiction problems, and that Hannah basically told him that if they were going to be together, that he had to get off of whatever substances he was on. And that even though Hannah was pregnant with someone else's child at the time that they were dating, Corey decided to continue to be with her because they had such a loving relationship. Now, before Hannah knew she was pregnant with her second child, Jake had already went to an attorney's office to get full custody of Sophia. But Hannah Mae would basically play them. She would go to the attorney's office and she would demand that they make certain changes to the custody agreement. And then when it was time for her to sign it, she just wouldn't sign the custody agreement. And then she also talks about how once the Wagner family found out that Hannah Mae was pregnant, they basically just left her alone for the time being. She shows that this is a pattern with the Wagner family, that once one of the sons have a wife or a girlfriend or somebody gets pregnant, they start this controlling behavior because Angela wants to take that person's baby and raise it as if she birthed this baby again. So she wants the baby to call her mother. She doesn't want the real mother really to have nothing to do with them. And the example of that she brought up was George Wagner IV, who's currently on trial, his ex-wife Tabitha. Now she goes on to bring up different instances where the Wagner family felt like Tabitha was poisoning their food and that they didn't like the way that Tabitha was raising George Wagner IV's son. But she talks about this one specific incident where Tabitha decided to stand up for herself, and she tells George Wagner IV that she's going to take their son and she's going to leave, and how his mother, Angela, got so mad that she threatened to go get a gun, and then she hit her or threw a 2x4 at her while Tabitha was leaving. And the reason I'm bringing up Tabitha is because she is set to testify in this trial. So the story goes, Tabitha and George Wagner IV, they get a divorce. Tabitha did not have a lawyer at the time. However, the Wagner family did have a lawyer. So she was basically bamboozled into signing over her parental rights to George Wagner IV. And the reason she agreed to this is because the Wagner family dressed it up as, we'll help you until you get on your feet. This is just a temporary solution. Once you get stable, you'll, get your son back. No problem. However, when she did get stable and she kept asking the Wagners for her child, they would not let her see her own child. And what she didn't know at the time was, since she had signed over all of her parental rights, it was the Wagners' discretion that would allow her to see her kids. So if they said she couldn't see them, she just couldn't see them. So remember when in the last video we talked about the text message or the private message from Facebook that Hannah sent out that basically said that they would have to kill her first. So what happened was Hannah and Tabitha's mother, Tess, were having a private conversation where Tess was just telling her not to sign any paperwork because that's what happened to Tabitha. And that's how Tabitha lost custody of her son, Bullvine. And that's basically what they were attempting to do with Hannah Mae Roden. They were going to try to have her sign paperwork saying that she gave up all of her parental rights so that they could take Sophia, and she wouldn't have access to her anymore. So just to jump ahead a little bit, Tabitha decided in 2015 that she wanted more visitation with Bullvine. But the Wagner, specifically Angela, didn't want that to happen. So Angela decided to start hacking into Tabitha and her mother Tess's Facebook account. She was hacking in to get dirt on Tabitha in the event that Tabitha decided to take legal action to get Bullvine back. This is when she discovered the message from Hannah Mae Roden, and this is confirmed by a laptop that was found and seized on a Wagner property during a search. So in my last video, I told y'all that Dana's sister Bobby Jo found the bodies, which she did, but there were 2 other people with her that I wasn't aware of. A guy by the name of Billy Morgan and his wife Emma Morgan, who used to stay with Bobby Jo at the time. I told y'all she went over there to feed the animals, which was true, but this was more like a job for her. They would go over there for $20 a day and do the chores around Christopher Sr.'s house. Those chores included feeding the animals, maybe mowing the lawn one day, just tidying up around his place. So Bobby Jo wouldn't go over there every day, nor would Billy go over there every day, but they would go often enough, maybe a couple times a week. Emma actually never usually goes over there, but they planned on going into town on the morning of the 22nd. So that's why she was in a car that particular day. Bobby Jo knows right from the beginning that something is wrong because Christopher Sr.'s truck is outside, and typically he is already gone for work by the time that they get there. 2, the inside dogs are now outside. 3, once she gets to the door is locked. So she has Billy Morgan come help her get the key and open the door. Once they get inside the house, Bobby Jo says that the furniture is disheveled, that you see tons of blood, and that you see drag marks from the living room through the kitchen into Christopher Sr.'s bedroom. They follow the drag marks, and that's where they find Christopher Sr., and that's where they find Gary Roden. She calls 911, and in my last video, I showed y'all the clips of the 911 call. However, she decides to then go to Frankie's house to let him know what happened to his father and what happened to Gary. When she gets to Frankie's house, she says that there is no answer, but she can hear Frankie's 3-year-old son making noise behind the door. So she tells the 3-year-old to open the door, and with her help, they were able to get the door open. So once she gets inside Frankie's house, the 3-year-old makes a reference about blood, and she goes to find Frankie. Once she gets into the bedroom of Frankie and Hannah Hazel, she sees that they've both been shot, but that their 6-month-old is still in the middle of them, covered in blood. She says she grabs the baby, she grabs the 3-year-old, and she leaves the house. So by this time, law enforcement is starting to arrive. Now, just to put it in perspective, Frankie's house is first, Chris Sr.'s house in the middle, and Dana Roden's house is on the opposite end of Frankie's house. So the police are coming from 2 separate directions. They're coming past Dana's house, and they're also coming past Frankie's house to get to Christopher Sr.'s house, since that's where the 911 call was originated from. While Bobby Jo was going to Frankie's house, Billy Morgan decided to go to Dana's house to tell Dana what happened to her ex-husband, and he also was going to go to Dana's parents' house to let them know what was going on. Canepa says that Billy Morgan is going to testify that when he got to Dana's house, he called out for her, but she didn't answer, and he decided to just keep going to Dana's parents' house to let them know what happened. So then Canepa introduces Dana's brother, and his name is James Manley. James Manley is going to testify that once he saw Billy Morgan go to his parents' house, he didn't know what was going on, but he knew it was important by the way his parents rushed out the house. So he got in his own car and he followed them back to Frankie and Hannah Hazel's house. And that's where he finds out what happened to Christopher Sr., and he decides to go tell Dana what happened to her son and her ex-husband. Canepa says he's going to testify that once he gets to Dana's house, the door is a little bit open. He decides to go to her room. She's covered, but there's a pillow over her face. He tries to lift the pillow up. He realizes that it's sticking to her face, and he realizes at that point she's also been murdered. James is also supposed to testify that Hannah's 5-day-old baby was crying, but he couldn't bring himself to go see anything further. So he leaves the residence and he goes and gets his wife, April Manley, to tell her what is going on. So while the police are trying to pass Frankie's house, they realize that there is a bunch of people collected there. And then on the opposite end, James and April Manley are flagging down police at Dana's house to tell them that there's also another victim in this house. So police secure the scene. They go in, they find Hannah Mae as well as little Chris deceased, as well as Dana. They also find Hannah Mae's 5-day-old daughter, and they take the baby, they take her to EMT, make sure she's okay, and then they give the baby to April Manley. She goes on to talk about how Chelsea, Frankie's 3-year-old child's mother, came and got him, and the other 2 kids, they went to the hospital just to be checked. Canepa explains how the rest of the family members are starting to show up, and the police decide to move the remaining family members to a church down the street from where the crime scene happens. And this is so that the family can interact with the police can interact with the family. She then goes on to explain how the rest of the family has been calling Kenneth Roden and they weren't getting any response. But they didn't panic because he usually didn't answer his phone while he was at work. And that particular day, he was supposed to be at work. But after his lunch break had came and went and he still didn't respond to anybody's calls, texts, or anything, the family decided to go down to his place. So Luke Roden, who is Kenneth's son, his friend Sean Watson, and his other friend Donald Stone decide to go down there to see what's going on with Kenneth. Donald volunteers to go in so that Luke doesn't have to, and they find Kenneth deceased as well. Now, once police realize how large this crime is, they decide to call in the BCI. And the BCI is Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigations. You've heard me say it before in previous videos. And they come in specifically to investigate what happened at this crime scene. And it's often used for larger crimes and or communities who don't have their own criminal investigation team. She talked about how Jake and George dyed their hair based off of The Walking Dead and Boondock Saints because Jake felt like he looked like one of the actors. She then goes on to say that BCI suspected that a silencer was used because none of the victims woke up during this time. The only 2 victims that were actually awake was Christopher Sr. and Gary Roden. So then she goes on to talk about the evidence that was found. So once the bodies are removed from Christopher Sr.'s house, they find a .40 caliber shell casing, which is associated with a Glock. It is the same gun that is used to kill Chris Sr., Gary Roden, and Kenneth Roden. She talks about how the other 5 victims, which is Frankie, Hannah Hazel, Hannah Mae, Little Chris, and Dana Roden, are killed with a smaller caliber weapon, a .22 caliber, and that a high-powered rifle was used to shoot Christopher Sr. as well. So remember my last video when I said whoever did the killings knew the Roden's habits? Well, Christopher Sr.'s house had video surveillance and Kenneth Roden's house had video surveillance, and those were removed from the home. Also, Dana, Hannah Mae, and Christopher Jr. had just moved into that house 30 days prior to the murders, and only somebody that knew them would have known that. She also talks about the shoe prints that are found in Christopher Sr.'s house, which is a 10 and a size 11 in the same shoe. The same 11 size shoe was also found in Dana Roden's house. So the BCI expert is supposed to testify that those shoes came from Walmart and she herself went out and searched for those shoes. So she also talks about how the BCI agent knows that the shoes are either new or fairly new. They haven't been really worn down. So they were able to ask within a 50-mile radius all the Walmarts to send their surveillance to see if they could find out who purchased those shoes. And they do see Angela Wagner purchasing the shoes. She also goes in to say that all the people who found any of the victims, which is Bobby Joe, Billy Morgan, Emma Morgan, and James Manley, all of their shoes were tested, and it's all confirmed that their shoes do not match the shoes that was found at the crime scene. She then goes on to speak about what made them look at the Wagners, and it was basically Jake and Billy Wagner's fault because, as I told you in the last video, Jake was doing all of these interviews and he was acting like the doting father and that he was so hurt that this happened. I told you he even went so far as to start a GoFundMe account. But once the investigating team got the data from the cell phones as well as Facebook data, they noticed that the relationship is not what he made it appear to be. So Jake and Billy Wagner also refused to give up their phones, but Billy took it a step further because it is reported that he and Christopher Sr. were in the marijuana business together. So he was going around telling people that this happened because of a very large drug buy and that he may be next. The only problem with that was he wasn't hiding. And the reason Billy Wagner gave for not giving up his cell phone was that him and Chris Sr. were best friends. And once this crime happened, he was so distraught that he continued to try to call Chris Sr.'s phone over and over again. And because Chris never answered, it frustrated him and he broke his phone. But by this time, the investigators had already had the cell phone records, so they knew that Billy never tried to call Christopher Sr. So to sum it all up, once the inconsistencies began to pile up, the investigators decided to get search warrants for the Wagner household. So with that search warrant, they found shell casings that matched the shell casings from Hannah Mae, Dana Roden, Little Chris, Frankie Roden, and Hannah Hazel. It's the .22 caliber shell casings. It's reported that the Wagners were shooting that gun as target practice. The day that they got the search warrants for the Wagner household, the Wagners had picked up and moved to Alaska. But the neighbors of the Wagners let them know that the Wagners had put their belongings on some trailers. So they got search warrants for the trailers. And then when they went to search the trailers, they found a tote with important things in it, which had the receipt from April 7th of 2016 for the Walmart shoes. So they also found custody documents saying that if something were to happen to Hannah Mae, that she would want custody to go to Jake Wagner. Then Jake and George both signed papers that said if something happened to them, that they would want their kids, Sophia and Bluevine, to go to Angela Wagner. Now, Kneppel was able to show that the paperwork from Hannah was supposed to be signed on December 24th of 2014. And that Jake and George signed their paperwork in March of 2015, but that the document didn't exist until April 3rd of 2016. Basically means that these documents had to be forged. They also found a typed up list of demands for Hannah Mae regarding Sophia. They found a brass catcher and they found the cell phone jammer. She talks briefly about Angela's mother, Rita Newcomb, and how she was charged for forgery because of the document that Hannah was supposed to sign in 2014. So she was supposed to be the notary on that document, but at the time, nobody knew that Angela had signed everybody's signature. So she was charged for the crime, but her crime was reduced to a misdemeanor. She then goes on to start speaking about the Wagners' financials and how from February to March of 2016, the Wagners bought parts to make a silencer. That how on April 19th of 2016, George bought masks, that Jake's reward card bought bullets and ammo, and that Angela bought a cell phone jammer. Kneppel tells the jury that as a family, they move as one unit and financials is no different. So even though it says one person bought it, it's everybody's money that they use. So I told y'all earlier in the video about the laptop. They also found a picture of Jake holding one of the murder weapons in that laptop as well. She then goes on to talk about the wiretaps that are put on their phones and how 2017 they didn't have too much evidence because the Wagners were really cautious about being monitored. She talked about a conversation that Angela and Jake had when they put in the ground penetrating radar machines, and Angela basically wanted to know what they were out there looking for, which barn they were searching, because the Wagners had took all of the victims' cell phones except for Frankie's and Hannah Hazel's. But in 2018, because they kind of left them alone for the year that they were in Alaska, that they started to speak more freely and that the jury will be able to hear what they are saying on those phone calls. So with the indictment coming down, the investigators decided to check the barn that Angela was so adamant about in 2017. And the reason they didn't check it in 2017 is because it had 2 possums inside of it. So she talks about how the property is sold to a new owner, but the cistern had not been checked. The investigation team goes out, and that's where they find the homemade silencer. She also talks about how the silencer had a serial number, which eliminates the possibility of it having more than one owner. She goes on to commend the investigation team because everything that they pieced together as far as this crime has been corroborated by Jake. She then goes over the fact that Jake is going to testify in this case, and that he has 8 life sentences, or he will be sentenced to 8 life sentences, and then he also has 78 years in specifications, and that he has to serve the 78 years before he even gets to the 8 life sentences. But with his testimony and this plea deal, he does not have the death penalty on the table for him. She elaborates on both Jake and Angela's testimony, and because it's going to come up in trial and this video is already so long, I'm not going to go into detail, but she did for another hour. She then talks about every charge that George is charged with, and then she wraps up her opening statement. So Richard Nash gave the opening for the defense team, and he did a much better job on the time. So he starts by saying that April 22nd of 2016 was a normal day for George, and that the only thing that he saw that was different was Jake was up before him. And Jake was usually the second one to rise, but once he woke up, he saw that Jake was already doing tasks around the house. He then talks about the tasks that George had to do and how they met up with each other, Jake and George, to complete the rest of the task for the day. He talks about how Jake got a phone call from a guy named Andrew Carson to tell about what happened at the Roden household, and how Jake put on a award-winning performance, and that was the first time that George heard about any murders. He then talks about how Jake was interviewed 4 times by BCI, how Angela was interviewed 4 times by BCI. Talks about how George Wagner III, or Billy, how he was also interviewed 3 times by BCI. And how George Wagner IV was only interviewed the 1 time that they were stopped at the border. Nash then goes on to talk about how BCI never asked for George's phone or anything, and how when he was in the interview room that the special agent asked him if he wanted to be a suspect or a witness. Nash then tells the jury that this trial is about George IV, not the Wagner family, not anything that they've pled to, but George specifically and the evidence against George. So anytime that they hear they, them, the Wagner family, it should raise a red flag, and they should ask themselves, how does this evidence pertain to George? He then tells the jury that he wants them to pay attention to 5 things. 1 is what Jake says. 2, the credibility of Jake and Angela. 3, the incentives by the state of Ohio for Jake and Angela's testimony. 4, the motive. And 5, how different George is from the rest of his family. He then elaborates a little further into the 5 things. So what Jake says is basically that Jake is going to testify that George had nothing to do with the planning of the murders, that George didn't shoot anyone, and that George didn't destroy any evidence. It was all between himself, Jake, and his father, Billy. And that Billy got Angela involved because of the task that needed to be accomplished in order to commit this crime. He also states that Jake is going to testify that George wasn't even supposed to go. He then proceeds to blame everything on Jake. How Billy asked Jake to get the car for the crime. How Jake made the silencer by himself. How Jake watched Boondock Saints by himself. How the morning of the 22nd, it was Jake outside destroying all the evidence. Nash then talks about how Billy tasked Angela to get the shoes for the crime, and how she had to get a cell phone jammer and a bug detector, and how Billy would get rid of the car himself. Nash then goes on to talk about how Angela's a con artist, how she's been a con artist since George was 9, how she burned down several of their properties for insurance money, and he also brings up the GoFundMe account that Jake started after the crime. He then proceeds to do exactly what I said he was going to do in his last video, where he brings up that George was just born into the Wagner family, and George can't help who his family members are. Nash then says that Jake and Angela have conned the state of Ohio, how Jake conned them out of the death penalty, and how Angela conned them into a 30-year sentence. Nash says that the evidence will show that Jake himself killed all 8 victims, but he had to implicate Billy in order to get the plea deal. Nash then follows up with Jake's testimony is only going to implicate himself, that there's no independent evidence that George helped in any of these crimes. He then follows it up by saying that George didn't have a motive to kill anybody in the Roden family. Angela had motive because she worked herself up thinking something was going to happen to her granddaughter, Sophia. Jake had motive because he was already jealous that Hannah Mae was moving on, and Angela convinced him that something was going to happen to his daughter. Billy had motive because Billy was a part of Chris Roden Sr.'s drug operations. He talks about how Frankie and George Wagner IV were really good friends, and how George looked at Hannah Mae like a little sister. He follows up by saying that George didn't like the way that his family functioned, so much so that he would get into physical fights with his dad, Billy. And that in 2006, when George was just 16 and he got his driver's license, he actually ran away from home. However, because he was so young, he couldn't make it on his own, so he had to come back. But he talks about how George avoided the house as much as possible. He does talk on the Tabitha situation, and he just basically says Tabitha and George were too young, but that Tabitha had an opportunity to get a lawyer by her mother. Tabitha chose not to get a lawyer. Tabitha had all of the documents laid out as far as the custody agreement, and Tabitha went in and spoke with the judge and said she agreed to this custody agreement. He then finishes it up by saying that even the special agents told George that he did everything the right way as far as getting custody for his son, Bullvine. And he tells the jury that by the end of the trial that they would also see that George is different from his family and he had nothing to do with the crime. So real quick, my thoughts. I know Canepa was being thorough because it is the state's burden to prove guilt. However, that opening was so long. Ugh, it was hard. It was hard to get through. I hope they go back, they re-strategize, and come up with something better to get the questions out, to get the jury engaged, so that the case isn't lost just because you bored us to death. On the flip side of things, if the defense continues to act like George Wagner IV didn't know anything that was happening around him pertaining to his family, he was just wandering about and somehow he ended up in jail, he might lose a few jury members, but based off the opening statements alone, he is holding up a fairly good case. They don't really have any evidence that's directly tying George to the crime. So I don't know how the state plans on turning it around, but I am staying tuned. Anyway, those are my thoughts and my opinions. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching. Like, share, subscribe, and I'm out.